Welcome everyone. Again, another episode today here to Verano 1711 podcast. This is your host Marv. Today we've been cooking up this topic in the comments with people writing to me via email, Facebook, every social media venue, because this is I admittedly, this is a hot topic, but I can say this is also a very interesting one. And today I am joined by two gentlemen who have written in academic venues, books, articles regarding this very topic. And I think we are set to have a great discussion about this one. So I am joined by Professor Nathan MacDonald and also by Dr. Ken Brown. Gentlemen, thank you for kindly accepting our invitation and welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Great, thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much for having us. Yeah.
My pleasure. My pleasure. So, monotheism, it's a thorny term, if I can say that. And, that's the kind of term that can stir up the conversation because of perhaps the way academics, they have their own way to do things. And every now and often, you run into these discussions, and we as a layman, we have, at least we learn to be very careful to how to talk about these terms. So, you being Dr. MacDonald, he wrote his dissertation, correct me if I'm wrong. Actually, we got a corrected edition, which is a second edition. And Dr. Ken Brown, along with Professor MacDonald, they also went on and wrote a book, which is part of, group, research group, specifically on this kind of topics. And we're going to be talking about that further on the conversation. Now, before getting into things, I want you to please, just for everyone out there who doesn't know who you are, just give us a bit of a background, who you are, your degrees, area expertise, that kind of stuff. I'll go with Professor MacDonald first.
So I'm Nathan MacDonald. I'm the professor of the interpretation of the Old Testament at the University of Cambridge, where I'm also a fellow at St John's College. I was an undergraduate in Cambridge and did a master's there before going to Durham to do my PhD on Deuteronomy and monotheism with Walter Mobley. After that, I taught for several years at St Andrews and then went to Göttingen to lead a research team for several years, and then came back to Cambridge in 2013.
Great. Now, Dr. Ken Brown, now it's your turn.
I'm Ken Brown. I'm from Washington State. I did my undergrad and master's in Canada, and then I was in Germany to work on Nathan's research team at the University of Göttingen. He was one of my doctoral supervisors alongside Hermann Spiekermann. I wrote on the Book of Job and its development. I went on to do a postdoc in Mainz on Jewish Christian interpretation of the Jewish Bible. And now I teach at the University of Whitworth in Washington State.
Thank you so much. Okay, so people is responding here. All right, yeah. Thank you, Marta Spear. Yeah, we have excellent guests here. Yeah, from Germany. Okay, so let's jump right into the questions here. So, I want to just make sure that I'm stating the main goals of this interview. We want to, help to clarify terms, concepts, to bring some sanity. Social media, it's a wild world. And, people, during this time, you just need a camera, a microphone, find a real nice place and just turn it on and start talking. But there is a responsibility. And I think scholars, they have a great role to play in all of this. And we're just the messengers. We're just bridging the gap between the layman and the scholar. And that's all we want to do today. So let's go with the first questions, gentlemen. And it's popping up on the screen right there. So what's at stake when dealing with the topic of monotheism in the Hebrew Bible? Let's go with it. So let's go with Professor MacDonald first, okay?
So, I mean, I think I'd want to say there are at least there are a few ways in which we could tackle this question.
Okay.
One of them, which you've already raised, is what do we mean by the term monotheism? I think we might want to talk about that before we even start talking about what is at stake. And as you rightly pointed out, academics are very, very careful, or try to be very careful in the words that they use. And particularly when we're employing a concept like monotheism, I suppose we want to pull back and say, well, what kind of work is it doing for you? What do you hope to achieve with this word? And in particular, what might you be contrasting it to? So whenever we're looking at things like the biblical text, where or the biblical text in their ancient world, where we're trying to make distinctions and employ different categories. So if some texts are monotheistic, what is it if it is not monotheistic? What do we define? What do we mean by that? So how do we what kind of work are we hoping that it will do for us? How will it create us a more sophisticated understanding of the text and how we might divide them up? I mean, that's true of whatever we're talking about. I mean, that it's not only true of something like monotheism, it's also true of using terms like Deuteronomistic or priestly. What do we think we're doing when we're labeling in that way? And what are we trying to what are we trying to distinguish? And there are various things that are going on there. I mean, one is whenever we're trying to analyze ancient texts to read them analytically, we are having to bring this kind of conceptuality to make various distinctions. But also we don't want to use vocabulary in such a way that it becomes meaningless. So, for example, in the 1980s, there was a point at which, with something like Deuteronomism, it was so broadly applied that almost everything was becoming Deuteronomistic, and there were complaints about scholars were writing about sort of pan-Deuteronomism, everything becoming Deuteronomistic. And when a piece of analytical vocabulary is being used in such a way, it becomes virtually useless. It has no analytical cutting power. I'm reminded of sort of I don't know if you know the movie Incredibles 2, where Syndrome kind of says, if everybody's a superhero, nobody's a superhero. And we have that with some terms that they become so widely applied that they don't become useful at all. And so we need to think about, what are we trying to do with this vocabulary? What are we contrasting it to? So when we talk about monotheism, are we contrasting it to polytheism? And what exactly does that mean? But then also we might ask ourselves a question: what is that vocabulary? What work is that vocabulary doing on us? How, when we deploy these categories that are not the categories of the text itself, and that doesn't have to be a problem. I mean, we are trying to analyze text with our own vocabulary, with our own concepts. But how does that trammel our thought? How does that move it in certain directions? And that is potentially an issue with a term like monotheism. I mean, monotheism has its own history as a piece of vocabulary. It's a 17th century invention. I mean, I'm sitting currently 5 miles away from Cambridge, where it was invented in the 1660s. And it's vocabulary that was first deployed in the developing world of religions, and really the first encounter of early Enlightenment thought with a world of religious diversity. And so monotheism is what I love the quote that Nicholas Lash has about this. He described monotheism as a simple solution for a complex problem. As 17th century scholars are encountering the world, and they are encountering the world of they're beginning to encounter the world of East Asia, although it's very much on the very edge of their horizons. They really don't have a very sophisticated understanding of it, and they're also beginning to encounter the New World. So the world that they're experiencing is no longer simply a world in which there is Christianity and there's sort of earlier, as it was seen, earlier precursor to Christianity, Judaism, and then there is sort of as a threat on the periphery, Islam. So the world is no longer like that. Is now a much more kind of complex religious space. And in that world, how do you think about these different religious beliefs and practices? And the vocabulary that is used at that time is they begin to invent this vocabulary like monotheism to try and categorize that world. And as Lash puts it, it is a simple solution to a complex world. How do you think about different religions? Well, this way of categorizing religions categorizes them according to how many deities there are. Yeah, they got one. Have they got none? Have they got many?
Yeah.
And well, we might think, well, this is self-evident. I mean, this is how we, this is sensible. This is, I mean, we are so used to thinking in this way that it takes some work to actually think about the fact that actually is a very particular way of constructing the world and a very particular way of thinking about religion that very much prioritizes belief or what you think somebody believes. And also one particular aspect of that belief, and that is number of deities. And that is in many ways a very, very, fundamentally, it's a very Christian way of seeing things. Christians do say, I believe in one God, the creator, Father, creator of heaven and earth.
That's it.
So
yeah.
Christian thinking does sort of prioritize this particular aspect of religion. But if we ask the question of, well, how would other religions see? How would other religions categorize the religious world? This might not be where they would start. So our categories are not neutral, and they do move us off in certain directions. And when we're thinking about the categories that we're using, we do need to be rather conscious about that. So you took us at that question of conceptuality. How do we use this concept? But also, I mean, what's at stake? I would say in some ways quite a lot can be at stake, in the sense that we could see the question of monotheism in the Hebrew Bible as, in many ways, in Nietzsche, a larger question about does religion belief and practice in ancient Israel develop, or is it static? And in that development, at what point do various things come to fruition? And that can make quite a big difference to our understanding of ancient Israel, and also just to the Old Testament and how we think about its development, and whether we allow for a religious development. Did to put this most crudely, was everything revealed to Moses at Sinai, and nothing really added to that, or do we see a development, a change to Israelite religion over time? I mean, that kind of question would come out very clearly with, say, somebody like Yezikel Kaufman, great Israeli scholar in the earlier part of the 20th century, who did think that sort of Moses was fully a monotheist. He communicated a monotheistic faith, but it wasn't really understood by the Israelites. But essentially, it was all there right at the beginning. And if you look at Israel's history, it's really everything given at the beginning, and the prophets calling people back to that. And I suppose for someone like Kaufman as well, Mishnah and Talmud is really just developing things that are seen therein. In the Torah that's given to Moses. Whereas if you're looking at someone like Wellhausen, and Wellhausen's very famous work, The Prolegomena, much about what Wellhausen is doing in The Prolegomena is talking about religious change. How do we see religious change in terms of the Levites and the priests, in terms of do you worship God multiple temples or a single temple, and throughout that book he's tracing religious development throughout Israel's history, from its very beginnings through to through into the Second Temple period. So there is a lot at stake eventually.
Thank you. Yeah, it's actually good that you mentioned the Second Temple, because it's another point we're going to be talking about. Dr. Brown, give us your input, how you enrich even more. This is first question that I just throw at you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I agree 100% with everything Nathan just said. And I do think that the issue of definitions matters, because how we're defining the term is going to have a huge impact on where we see it and what we, if you have a very strict definition of monotheism, then you're going to find it a lot fewer places than if you have a more expansive definition. But to me, I think that the bigger issue than definitions, and I do think we'll need to talk more about them, but the bigger issue is what Nathan was just talking about, the fundamental question of, do we see Scripture, whether we're talking about the Hebrew Bible or Scripture more broadly, as something that's static, unchanging, represents one single perspective, or something that's dynamic, changing, reflects a variety of different viewpoints across time, space, and so on. And so if we're thinking about the question of monotheism in the Hebrew Bible as kind of yes or no question, is the Hebrew Bible as a whole monotheistic, we're going to run aground real quick because there are lots of different texts that have all sorts of different ways of portraying God and other deities and humans and every possible aspect of those things. But if instead we're thinking about what are the ways in which these texts portray God and who God is and how God relates to the rest of the divine realm and creation and humanity, then it's still going to matter a great deal how we're thinking about terms like monotheism, but it's also going to matter how we think about what are these texts actually trying to do. And if we are allowing ourselves to not assume they all reflect one perspective, then not only might we find a kind of developmental pattern, but we also might find that it doesn't map to a single trajectory. It doesn't require us to accept, it was one thing then, and then it was something else entirely later, that multiple perspectives can exist side by side and even argue with each other. And that's something that's true in the Hebrew Bible, I think. It's also true of the later traditional interpretation of these things. I mean, you still see it in the rabbinic literature. They don't have one view of how God relates to the rest of the divine realm. And so I do think the definitions are important, but I think that more fundamentally, we want to think about how do these texts engage with each other, with their backgrounds. There are certainly tensions, for instance, between how particular biblical authors want to present the truth and what they assume their co-religionists actually believe or do. And so having the space to explore those kinds of nuances, I think, is really important. But having clear definitions, I think, not that we want to impose them on the text, but they just help us be clear about what we're saying when we talk about these things.
Thank you for saying that.
I mean, because all of these things are heuristic. They're all just our attempts to distill something. But I mean, I really like that statement. It's a simple solution for a complex world. That's true of the 17th century. It's equally true of the ancient Near East. It's equally true of the Hebrew Bible itself. And so giving the text the space to be complex, I think, is the most fundamental thing.
Thank you. Well, actually, we have a coin here. I think it's from, is this from Yehud? Help me with the location there. I found this this picture in the my German is still bad. You can help me on that. But and that is the website, and this is the Sofia Kovalevskaya. Am I saying that right? Because I understand you have produced 4 volumes so far. I don't know. You can tell us if there is something more to come in the future. I hope that's the case. And in those 4 volumes, there are 2 that stood out to me. The first one was written by Matthew Lynch, which is Monoteísmo and the Book of Chronicles, if I'm not mistaken. And the second one is this one that I have right here, which is something that you both co-wrote. And this is the one that Professor MacDonald, via email, he suggested to review, or just to see what the kind of, input the academics you put together contribute to this topic. So I just want to ask about this group, how this came out, what's the history behind it, because I'm very interested, and I'm pretty sure my audience is going to be interested if they don't know what it is. So give us a bit of like a summary. What's this all about, Professor MacDonald?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the group ran from 2009 to 2014, so it already, I suppose for me, it already feels a little bit like it was a while ago now. What I wanted to do was really to push the discussion about monotheism into different periods than it often gets discussed.
Okay.
And part of that was a sort of frustration that arose from many accounts that had sort of appeared from the 1980s onwards that were really trying to unsettle what had been the previous consensus, which was that monotheism was sort of relatively early. And in unsettling that, you then got many accounts of, I suppose, what you might call a sort of a history of God. And these really described how monotheism was perceived to have emerged within ancient Israel, how early Israelite religion was not monotheistic, and then how some sort of breakthrough to monotheism had come sometime around the exile was where many scholars were now beginning to think this had happened. My concerns were sort of twofold. I mean, on the one hand, I felt that the very odd thing about this discussion was that we were interested, we might say, in the gestation of monotheism. So how did monotheism arise, rather than its sort of instantiations, it's how it appeared in the Second Temple period. And sort of coupled with that was a concern that the variety, the diversity of monotheism was being lost by emphasizing this sort of trajectory that saw Israel move from perhaps a polytheistic or a henotheistic context to becoming a more monotheistic one. That this tended, as Ken said, to sort of trammel things into a sort of single a single line, rather than recognizing that actually there was often in expressions of belief and practice in early Judaism, sort of Second Temple Judaism, that there was actually much more diversity there. So, I mean, if we're going to use the language of monotheism, the kinds of expressions of, we might say that that say Deuteronomy and in its final form, and Ezekiel and the priestly literature are all monotheistic. We might, particularly if we kind of compare them to Near Eastern literature, we can say, well, all of this literature is very, very different from Near Eastern literature. We've got multiple gods, and there seems to be much more emphasis on one single deity. But the kinds of expressions of monotheism that we find in those books are very, very different. So, for example, we might say, if we think about the nomenclature, about what you call other gods. So Deuteronomy is very, very happy to talk about other gods. This is the Ten Commandments. You shall have no other gods. So we can see this. I mean, we can say this is a kind of a form of monotheism.
Yeah.
Because the existence, you're not allowed to worship other gods, and I mean, it depends what you mean by monotheism there. I mean, this looks more like, some scholars would call it monolatry, but there is an emphasis on single deity. But this is very different from Ezekiel, who cannot even imagine calling these other divine beings gods. He's got various negative terms and for other gods, but he will never call them gods. He would never call them Elohim. Or we might think of, say, if we contrast the priestly monotheism to Deuteronomic monotheism, if that's what we want to call them, you would say, the priestly literature begins with, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So here we have, we have one single deity involved in the creation of the world, but it's about creation, and creation plays a very, very important role within the priestly literature. But creation is nowhere to be seen in the Deuteronomic literature. Nowhere in Deuteronomy do we find mention of the act of creation. So I think there's one of my concerns with the project was trying to deal with was to was to think of the kind of variety and diversity of monotheism that we see in early Judaism or early Second Temple Judaism.
Thank you. Something that really caught my attention is that this team conducts research, as you can see on the screen, on the unity and diversity of monotheisms, as at the end, in the biblical text from the exilic and Persian periods, which is perhaps this is something like Dr. Brown was saying previously. Perhaps we are confusing or taking things like black and white, and perhaps it's not that way. Sometimes the process seems to be more complex than when we think in the first place. Dr. Brown, do we know the deity on that coin? Do we know what deity is that? Or people, archaeologists, you, biblical scholar, only know that this is a deity because of the portrayal, that we can see on the coin?
I'm not sure that I can speak to the coin. But what I can say for sure is not about the coin, but that one of the things that really came out of the research group was just the way that not only do you have this kind of change and transition across Israel's history, but even in the post-exilic period, even in Yehud, after the return to the land, you still have this variety of different perspectives on how the God of Israel, under various names, relates to what we would think of as other gods. And so you have something like Ezekiel. That's a little bit earlier, or at least certain parts of it might be, but doesn't want to call anybody gods. You have other texts that are quite happy to identify the God of Israel with the God of heaven, worshipped by the Persians. You have texts like Job, which I think is a Persian period text, that quite happily refers to a whole range of figures that resemble figures you find in various mythological texts from across the ancient Near East, all presented as, in one way or another, kind of agents of the single God that, has control not only over all of creation, but even the underworld. And it's something that Job's friends find really comforting, that, God's even, condemning the wicked and using the gods of death to do that, and something that Job finds terrifying because there's nowhere he can go to escape this all-powerful God. And so they all have this kind of core conception that there's one God who's basically in charge of everything, but the way they describe that, even in this relatively late period, can be radically different. And how concerned they are about the possibility of there being other active agents in the cosmos beyond that one God, or below that one God, or alongside that one God, comes out in all sorts of different ways. And so when you have, whether a coin or epigraphic evidence, where you find evidence that some people in the early Persian period still believed that there were other gods, or were still willing to use images to depict God, like, okay, yeah, of course they were. But the question is, how are they thinking about that? And let's not come to just one answer about that. Let's look at particular examples and see, how are they depicting this, and where are their points of controversy? Because sometimes they aren't always in the same place that we would think they would be.
And we can safely say that we see that kind of phenomenon in the Hebrew Bible. Can we safely say that we find multi-vocalism in this kind of dispositions towards deities or the God of Israel? I don't see, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see one big monolithic kind of a thinking about the God of Israel. I see diversity. Perhaps because I'm reading right now Angelica Berlejung's new monograph. I think it's on Forschungen, Alten Testament, Yahweh's diversity, which is awesome. It's expensive, but it's awesome. It's awesome. Okay. Talking about, I think you hinted at my second question to you both, which is popping up on the screen right now. Let me know if you can see it. Because in this question, basically we're trying to go with, if we have epigraphic discoveries that challenge the idea of monotheism, and if yes, in what ways have these discoveries moved the whole academic conversation? Professor MacDonald, let's go with you first.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And you nicely, I mean, you've helped us, haven't you? Because you've given us the very famous inscription from Continuo, which is, which I mean, really had a very important, was a really important stimulus to that debate that began to happen in the 1980s onwards. It was sort of discovered, I think, in the mid 1970s, if I remember right, and you have this inscription that talks about the person who's writing it wishes to be blessed by Yahweh and his Asherah. And that sort of generated various questions. And that's the inscription you can see there, sort of over the top of these figurines, and you've got this female figure playing a lyre. You have these two they're an Egyptian best figures, which are the two sort of squatting deity figures that you can see just below the inscription. The inscription sort of written on top of it. So there was a very sort of lively debate from the 1970s onwards about, I mean, not only what this inscription meant, but also how it related to the iconography, and also how it was then, how we were going to sort of fit this into our understanding of Israelite religion. I mean, Continuo has been the sort of the, very sort of important point of stimulus. I mean, a lot of debate here about kind of like, does the Asherah here refer to a sacred pole, a sacred object? So we know about the Asherah from, we know about these sort of sacred poles from various texts in Kings, or is it actually the consort of Israel's God? And various debates about whether, in fact, a proper name can take a possessive suffix in that way, his Asherah. So this inscription was really important, and yet there's other pieces of evidence in some ways that have been known for much longer that actually are also highly pertinent. So we might, one of the things that we might think about also in this context are the finds from Elephantine. So the area of the Aswan Dam now in the south of Egypt, where we have a Jewish community, a garrison community, and we know that they have a temple. So this is in the 5th century. They have a temple that is not, there's clearly they don't have a problem with there being more than one temple. And also they seem to be worshipping a triad of deities there. So they have they seem to have Yahweh himself. They seem to have Anat Betel, and then they also seem to have a Eshem Betel, probably a son. And we know that after the temple has been destroyed and when they rebuild it again, one of the things that they do is they take a collection, or various people contribute silver for new divine figures, and they are creating new divine figures for all three of these figures, because they are all divine figures and they all receive some sort of cultic worship in this temple at Elephantine. So there, I mean, Continuo, this particular one that you're showing here has been enormously important, but actually there is other evidence, that was already known actually at the end of the 19th century, the beginning part of the 20th century, that already suggested that Judahites, or those who identified as Judahites, because that's what they call themselves, Yehudim, that they didn't hold what what becomes the sort of later kind of consensus view, we might say, within the Hebrew Bible, which is, in many ways is a very characteristically monolatrous text, even if it's not entirely clear that it's a monotheistic one. It's fairly most of the texts within the Hebrew Bible seem to be very orientated towards the idea that you worship only one God, even if the existence of other gods is allowed, or or conceived of.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Brown, what do you think about this question? Yeah.
I mean, the particular example you've got there is interesting for various reasons, one of which is it's not just Yahweh and his Asherah, however you understand Asherah, but it's also you've got these in this and related texts, inscriptions, Yahweh of Samaria and Yahweh of Taman. So you have this kind of like multiple instances. And is that just, various locations of the same deity, or are they thinking of these as separate deities? You have similar references to the Baal of various places in some Ugaritic literature, for instance, but whether the conception is the same there or not. I think that in some ways, though, like these kinds of examples, while they are a reminder that life on the ground is a lot more complex than maybe some of the kind of simplistic either portrayals within biblical texts or the way the biblical texts have been read might imply. I don't think that too much emphasis should be placed on particular examples, because I feel like when we're talking about the relevance of epigraphic or broader ancient literature for understanding something like biblical monotheism, the reach is far wider than a few examples. Like the whole body of ancient Near Eastern literature reshapes our understanding of what do we mean by deity and how can the gods relate to each other. I mean, when you have something like Enuma Elish, which is not a new discovery, associating Marduk with a whole bunch of other gods, like there's some sort of divine coalescence there happening that it's not really monotheism, but it's something. And you have all sorts of texts that challenge our conception of what a god is. You have, for instance, Mark Smith and Handy have talked about like 4 different tiers of deity in the ancient Near East. The high god and maybe his consort, and then the council of the gods who are, second, third, fourth generation gods, but still have a lot of power. And then you have these kind of craftsman deities, and then you have kind of messenger deities who later on get interpreted as angels. But like the same term could be used for all of them. They can all be called gods, even though ancient people would have thought of them in quite different ways. And in some cases, those kinds of categories get collapsed in some of the biblical literature. But in other ways, they seem to kind of persist in certain ways. And so thinking about whether it's monotheism itself or just our conception of God in light of that broader ancient Near Eastern background, I think helps just enrich our understanding and challenges a lot of assumptions about what it means to talk about one God. And I don't think that it dismisses the distinctiveness of the biblical tradition by any means. Like these texts are maybe not unique, but certainly highly distinctive in that broader context. You don't have anything quite like them, but that doesn't mean that they came out of nowhere, or that they aren't connected to that broader tradition, or they aren't shaped by it or interacting with it, or that readers at the time and later weren't themselves influenced by those concepts and read them in light of that. And so rather than fixating, I think, on particular examples, I think it's important to try to look as broadly as we can at the various ways in which deity, either in general or in particular cases, is understood both in Israelite literature and inscriptions, but also among its neighbors, whether we're talking about Ugarit or Babylonia, where the Israelites get exiled, or Egypt, where a lot of them escaped to at the same time and then lived for centuries afterwards. So like you can't pluck Israel out of its broader ancient Near Eastern context and try to understand it. It's embedded in it. And so the whole breadth of that literature helps us understand it on a deeper level.
As you were talking, Ken, I was reminded of 1 Samuel 28, as you were talking about kind of what gods could mean and the various tiers that Handy and Smith identify. I was reminded, that you've got this, Saul asks that Samuel be brought up from the dead, and of course, very famously, when he appears, he's called an Elohim. He's called a god.
An Elohim, yeah. Thank you for saying that.
It's a lovely example of of how the categories with the ancient Israelites themselves would have thought in are very often very different from our own.
And that's okay. This is something, my personal testimony, if I can put it that way. The first time that I read about that history, just drilling down a little bit into the Hebrew, you just run into that word Elohim, because I don't know, maybe it's plus 2,000 times that word occurring in the Hebrew Bible, and most of the times the main character is the God of Israel, and then boom, you go and Samuel, he's calling Elohim. And I remember so distinctively my mentor, the late Semitist, Michael Heiser, he if you do a little bit of research, which is not fun because you have to go and check every occurrence of this word, you will realize that this word is basically used for a variety of characters in the Hebrew Bible. And that changes a little bit the discussion right there. Okay. And talking about divine beings, I think our third question is going right there. Let me know if you can see it right there in the screen. So because this one, I like this one very much because it has to do with Psalm 82. And as you better know, this is a very, what's the best way, I'm trying to be charitable here. But this is a very highly, I'm not sure if this contested is the best word, but let's put it that way. It's a highly contested text because, those characters in the passage. So the question to you is this: how accurate are the following two propositions? Psalm 82 is the clearest smoking gun kind of evidence against any notion of monotheism in the Hebrew Bible. And second, Isaiah, which is chapters 40 through 55, represents a mature form of monotheism because it simply leaves no room for the existence of other gods. So let's go with you first. Dr. Brown, how would you respond to these two propositions?
I mean, the simple answer is I don't think either one of them is accurate. But why they're not accurate, I think, is the interesting.
Dr. Brown, he's very pragmatical. He doesn't complicate himself. I like that.
That in the first case, Psalm 82 is a fascinating psalm. I don't think you can call any text a smoking gun unless you want to say that there's hundreds of smoking guns lying all over the place. But like,
put it right there.
Let's see. If your question is, is the Hebrew Bible as a whole monotheistic, then, one counterexample, whether it's Psalm 82 or any number of others, might disprove it, and there's your smoking gun. But if your question is, does the Hebrew Bible or Psalm 82 particularly elevate one God above all others, then that gets a lot more complicated. And similarly, if you're talking about Isaiah as a mature form of monotheism, that may well be true, but the second part of that question, because it doesn't leave any space for any other gods, it's a questionable reading of Isaiah, but it's also not how a lot of other subsequent biblical literature interpreted it. So Job is clearly influenced by Isaiah, and yet has no problem describing all sorts of divine or quasi-divine figures. And so if we think, oh, well, here's the end of the road, it proves, finally there's no other gods. Well, that's apparently not how most of the later biblical authors themselves thought. And so, I mean, it comes back to where we started. Like, if you're looking for a single trajectory, if you're looking for a yes or no answer to is the Hebrew Bible monotheistic, then, well, both of these texts are going to be a problem for you. But if you're instead trying to make sense of what is distinctive about how these texts are portraying God, well, there's a lot to say about that. I mean, the way that Psalm 82 plays with the terms Elohim, you've got as a singular, but also as a plural. You've got questions about how,
right there.
How Elohim, whether as a singular or as a plural, relates to the Council of El, and then Elyon later on. Questions of, are these all the same God? Are they various gods? Well, there seems to be some sort of distinction because Elohim is condemning the Elohim. But at the end of the text, you have this kind of rejection of the rest of those Elohim, whatever they are, condemning them to death, and seemingly just leaving one to then take authority over the whole nation. So even if it doesn't start as what we would think of as monotheistic, it certainly ends with something more closely resembling that. But it's within a context in which there is a council of El, in which there are a variety of different beings that can be called Elohim who have authority over the nations. And I mean, Nathan could probably talk about the parallel in Deuteronomy 32, but like the way in which it elevates this one Elohim, which is presumably to be identified with Yahweh, over all others, is a really fascinating way of portraying the uniqueness of the God of Israel, which is quite different than the way Deutero-Isaiah presents the same thing. And so if you try to equate those into being one thing, then you're going to run into issues. But if you allow them to each speak in their own ways about the uniqueness of the God of Israel, then they both are doing something really interesting. It's not exactly the same thing, and maybe not exactly the same thing that later interpreters want to infer from them.
Yeah, thank you. Now you keep bringing up Job. Is this because you have reading an article regarding the firstborn of dead with monotheism? Does he have? I have read that article, just so you know. So, Dr. MacDonald, going with you, what do you have to say about this question?
I mean, to be contrarian, I might almost actually pull the two texts closer together.
It's getting good.
And I mean, I like the way that you framed it, because in some ways that is the way that they very often are framed, as sort of heading off in different directions. But I think, as Ken rightly says, Psalm 82 is taking us in a different direction towards the end. And you might say, you look at Second Isaiah talks about the hosts of heaven. And this is something that Saul Ollian in a couple of essays has disputed the idea that Second Isaiah is well described by vocabulary like monotheism. I mean, he's not the first to do that. Indeed, he's not the only one. But the way that Second Isaiah talks about the divine control over the host actually brings us quite close to Psalm 82. And Psalm 82, with its idea of the gods being judged and of them dying, in some ways brings us quite close to the kind of polemics we see in Second Isaiah. So, in some ways these texts are very different, but they've got quite a lot in common with one another, which is intriguing. The other thing I probably want to say about them, particularly Psalm 82, is actually even embedded in the Psalm 82 that we have now is this vocabulary of Elohim. This is usually seen as sort of part of the so-called Elohistic Psalter. So this is a part of the book of Psalms that appears to have been relatively consistently edited, such that the divine name, the Tetragrammaton, is removed and is replaced with Elohim. It's not consistent all the way through, but it seems to be a strong tendency. And that in itself looks like a kind of acts that would have taken place probably relatively late or well into the Second Temple period, and presumably by scribes who are concerned about the divine name being misused, but are also quite happy to sort of simply replace the Tetragrammaton, the divine name, by the term Elohim, and they know what that means. That just means it's Israel's God. It's not any other God. So there's also kind of with a lot of these texts as well, we have to remember that there's a lot of layering to them as well. They're not just and also a kind of layering where you presumably have got traders who are changing a name from the Tetragrammaton to Elohim, who are understanding this psalm as Ken says, in different kinds of ways. So biblical texts often don't have a single meaning. They have several meanings, and these are reflecting the different things that traders have been doing with the text over time. So, those would be the two things I would sort of throw into the mix. That actually Psalm 82 and Deutero-Isaiah are a lot closer together in some ways, but also that there is this development. I mean, within both texts actually. So even when we're wanting to distinguish between, I talked before about the differences between priestly P and Deuteronomy and Ezekiel. But even within those texts themselves have often extended histories, and scholars are sort of very often interested in sort of seeing how those texts have changed and altered over time, and the way that actually within the texts themselves there are often conversations taking place about, not only about deities, but about a whole host of questions.
Thank you, Professor MacDonald. Dr. Brown, you were about to say something. Yeah, go ahead.
I think it also comes back to where we started with the question of definitions too, because if your definition of monotheism is, there is only one God in existence, period.
Exactly. Yeah.
Then, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and Psalm 82 can seem like they're, very different places on that spectrum. Because obviously there's, other Elohim in Psalm 82, whereas you have these explicit statements in Deuteronomy, Isaiah of I am God and there is no other. But if monotheism is actually much more about one deity who is categorically supreme over all others, then, as Nathan said, these two texts, though they might seem on the surface radically opposed, are actually have quite a lot more in common with each other, because they both share this perception of there is the one God of Israel who is fundamentally different than all the rest. And so if we can move away from these kinds of binary definitions of monotheism as just there's no other gods in existence to something more about supremacy, more about categorical difference, more about difference between however you want to define it, and that gets messy. But then you can have these kinds of differences in portrayal and still see an underlying continuity and commonality even between texts like Psalm 82 and Deuteronomy, Isaiah.
And this is a world where, as we've seen with so many of these texts, imperial or royal metaphors are the most natural ones for these writers when they're thinking about God and when they're talking about God. And what kind of king doesn't have a court or an army? Even a title like the Lord of Hosts, Adonai Sabaoth, this is a divine army. You can talk about these as angels or divine figures or whatever you want to, but he has to have a court. He has to have a council where he is. There have got to be contexts in which he is recognized as supreme, and so this is never in any of the biblical texts a sort of how would you call it? Sort of an apophatic monotheism, completely detached from larger sort of metaphorical descriptions of God, and those descriptions are very, very often imperial or very, very often royal.
Okay, what you're seeing, the people in the audience, thank you for being here and dropping your comments. This is kudos to and credit where it's due. From Theory Unites, from Dr. Gavin Orland. So he collected these passages because he's responding to another scholar who is very popular on social media. You should know who I am talking about, but I won't spill the beans, sorry. So look at this. This is we have Isaianic, passages. And he goes on to say that this other scholar is arguing in a tradition of a scholarship with people like James Barr, who argue that this kind of statements doesn't mean that the other gods don't exist. These are incomparability statements. So, gentlemen, what do you have to say about these two passages? Also, I have another one for Deuteronomic passages, but please go ahead and just give me an answer to this question. Dr. Brown.
So the question is, are these statements in Deuteronomy, Isaiah about incomparability or the outright existence of other gods?
Yes.
Yeah, I think
do you see? Yeah.
I think that it's true that this is primarily about the incomparability of the God of Israel.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that I would completely dismiss the possibility that at least the rhetoric here can push towards something that feels a little bit more exclusive than that. Whether that was fully the intent or is simply the effect of this kind of rhetoric is, I think, an open question. But
okay.
Yeah.
I like that one. Professor MacDonald, what do you have to say about this one?
Yeah, I think Ken's described it very well. Many scholars have seen here something that's a lot would perhaps be better described as sort of monolitry in a very high and rhetorical register. So it's if you're going to emphasize just how different, how other the God of Israel is, then you reach for these kinds of rhetorical expressions that the other gods are nothing. One of the places that you might obviously see this, I mean, given that we're all coming from very different parts of the world, might have to have a bit of translation here, but maybe we'll just talk about football in general. But you'll see this about amongst football supporters, of whatever variety and whatever shape their balls are, in the sense that when they're describing their own team, they can they describe other teams as kind of nothing, or as completely destroyed, or as
this gentleman loves
they didn't turn up. They didn't turn up.
Or talking about your girlfriend as the only girl in the world.
yeah. I like that. I like that one better. Yeah.
Matt. Arsenal didn't turn up this week. Well, I mean, of course they did. They just were not very effective.
This is a fun conversation. I'm loving it. Yeah.
It's some of the challenges, of course, of reading this literature, and what the biblical writers are often not providing us with are indicative statements. They're not providing statements that this is this. They are, as we could, particularly in Second Isaiah, we've got a significant use of lots of different persuasive genres. This is one of the great rhetorical acts within the Hebrew Bible when you turn to Second Isaiah. He's using the courtroom scene. He's using salvation oracles. He's using all these different rhetorical means to persuade his audience. Of the of the counter, or we might say the counterintuitive idea that actually the Babylonian gods are nothing. The gods of the imperial power that have dominated the Near East for 70, 80 years are nothing, and that in fact, what might seem a completely odd thought, that the God of Judah, who had his temple in Jerusalem, is actually the one who created everything and made this all happen for his own purposes. He's not offering us here a systematic theology or a sort of philosophical theology. He's trying to persuade his audience of something, and so we do have to read the literature aware of these features of its genre.
And that last part, I like it because for a moment I thought Professor MacDonald was in preaching mode, and I love that. So, yeah. Now, let me tell you both about this. Those statements, I don't have the biblical chapter and verse. Please forgive me. Give me grace on that. But those statements like Yahweh, the Lord of the gods, or he is the God of the gods. My mentor used to say, well, if you say that the other God don't exist, that they are nothing, just like no existence at all. So how do you explain those kind of statements? So you're saying Yahweh, the God of Israel, is the Lord of nothing? Like, come on. So, and that's the other thing, that kind of the angle that I like to see this, at least is one of the angles that I like to ponder on this type of passages. So I think we covered that question regarding the Deuteronomy and Isaiah passages. Now, Psalm 82, I think we're right on that. I remember Cyrus, a famous article from Cyrus Gordon. I think it's repudiated the term that he used, because people went on to translate as judges and everything. But can we safely, this is a direct question to you both, can we safely say that the Elohim in the Psalm 82, they are indeed gods? Or am I missing something here as a layman? Is there any other reading or translation trick that I need to be aware of, or what can you tell me about that? I just want to feel safe about this Psalm 82.
I think I'm happy with that. I think you're safe. Is it absolution you're looking for, Marv? You can have absolution if you want to.
Yeah. I mean, because as you know, again, like I was saying at the beginning of the interview, people on social media, they went on to say, because they don't want to compromise their I don't know, fundamentalism or whatever, and they argue that these are basically human beings. I don't know how you go or you get to that conclusion. I mean, the text itself is very clear, as you were explaining. So I don't know how people come up with different positions about this psalm. It's very clear. Perhaps, to my knowledge. Go ahead, Professor MacDonald. Go ahead.
This history of sort of trying to make sense of these texts in different ways. I mean, there is a very long history of that, and of course, it does go back.
I know there is indeed.
We're seeing, we're potentially seeing some examples of it already with the Septuagint, but certainly already in early Christian interpretation, we're seeing that, particularly with some of these passages that are more puzzling. You can think of the sons of God in Genesis 6, the ways that various sort of already in some early Christian interpreters are trying to find different ways around that, and that. So there's a very, very long history with a lot of these texts that tries to understand them in alternative ways. And very often, for example, with the term Elohim, we'll go and sort of, as we've already talked about, your 2,500 references to Elohim, there is some variety amongst there, and so some already interpreters are going and sort of finding some examples which they can then say, oh well, that meaning applies here. So the idea that the Elohim might be important figures, might be judges, is then sort of extracted from another text or attributed to another text and then applied here. So this is all part of the very, very long and rich and actually very interesting and fascinating history of the story of these texts. I might not think that's what the writers originally meant, but I wouldn't want to lose some part of that sort of, enormous interpretive richness.
Thank you. Now, before getting to you, Dr. Brown, I was just going to say that perhaps, I'm not 100% sure, but perhaps people draws that conclusion is because the way Jesus quoted the Psalm 82 in John 10, if I'm not mistaken, leaving the door open that the Elohim can be humans. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there is rabbinic evidence that they saw like a double entendre, double meaning, capturing not only divine beings but also human beings. But again, in my opinion, my humble opinion, that's post-biblical times. I mean, that's my only objection. But Dr. Brown, to that question that I just posed to you both, what do you have to say?
Yeah, I think it's important to pay attention to that broader history of interpretation, which does include something like John 10:34, where Jesus, at the very least, associates these Elohim with human beings. But also, you've got a range of different ways in which these texts were interpreted, for instance, in the rabbinic literature, some of which could see them as humans and others didn't necessarily. And they are trying to make sense of a difficult, confusing text in light of their own frameworks. And those frameworks certainly, by the early Christian and rabbinic periods, start to have a much more exclusive understanding of who God is. And so a lot of these kinds of texts then could be reinterpreted in light of that. Within its own context, it seems to kind of undermine the point of the text if the gods are already human and they're being condemned to death. But that's not necessarily to rule out the connection, because you've got parallels with Genesis 2 and 3, where you've also got these concepts of knowledge and eternal life and death, meaning not you die immediately, but you're no longer immortal. Peter Machinist has talked about those parallels. So no, I think it's fairly clear in its original context that Psalm 82 means gods when it talks about Elohim, but I don't think that when later tradition interprets that in other ways, including as humans, that they're completely without foundation. Partly because of the way, the variety of ways that the term Elohim is used across the rest of the Jewish Bible.
All right. Okay. I want to tell you something. I got here one of my co-hosts. None of them could make it. Well, the first one because he's presenting his thesis. He's studying in Russia in University of St. Petersburg, and so he couldn't make it. Now here's Joshua, who is another of my co-hosts. He's studying at Edinburgh. He's getting ready to complete his thesis. I don't know if he already finished it. I hope he did. But he has two questions. Well, actually one question and a comment. So I would like to leave this question to the very end. I don't know what you think. Oh, if you like that way, you tell me. But I want to read this comment on his part. He says, some conservative Christians insist that the New Testament never accepted the divine council belief. There, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 8, are here really monotheism being declared or not? Now, Marduk Speed said, what do MacDonald and Brown think of Michael Heiser? Well, I will leave that also to the very end. But thank you for your question, Marduk. It's a good thing. And here's the comment on behalf of Joshua. The Amherst 63, which is a papyrus, if I'm not mistaken. Am I right? Mm-hmm. Is this a papyrus? Yeah?
Yeah.
Thank you. Is an important source of near the Second Temple period of Jews and still believes in Yahweh among the other gods. In the Passover papyrus, it says, greetings from the gods. Any opinion? Would you like to give an answer to that, Professor MacDonald, and then Dr. Brown?
Well, I mean, we can start with Papyrus Amherst 63, which is a complex text that, I mean, at least to my eyes, looks like it's a sort of it's a compilation of various different texts, probably with a quite a complex tradition history, and some of those texts mention Sumerians, some of those texts mentions also Babylonian deities. It's not. I mean, I think I would sort of say two things about it. I mean, I think one is that this is a text that the text itself has been known for a long time, but actually, it's a very difficult text to. It's been a very difficult text to interpret and translate because it's Aramaic, but it's written in a Demotic script. So it was only fairly recently that it was translated, or even though it'd been known for quite a long time. And I think in some ways it would be fair to say that the interpretation of all parts of it is not established yet. It's still a lot of controversy about different parts of the text, and I think the overall sense. I think there's quite a. I don't think we're in a place yet where there's agreement about what the text means and what the different parts of it mean. I mean, there are some very interesting things in that text. There is a version of Psalm 20, which is different from the Psalm 20 that we know in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, someone like Karel van der Toorn thinks that it's in many ways the story of an entire community, and that it can sort of be read almost like almost narratively. And I'm not sure that will be a position that's sustained, but it's yet to sort of really have sort of a lot of critical sifting and analysis. So I think it's a very interesting text, but there's a lot more work to be done on it. I mean, in terms of, these texts from Elephantine, they do acknowledge other gods in the sense that the Jewish garrison, or the Yehudite garrison, which would probably be a more accurate way to describe it, the Yehudite garrison that's there in Elephantine is there's an Aramaic garrison on the mainland in Sinai. It's a multi-ethnic community. We know that from many of the names. Obviously, there's a native Egyptian population, but there are other names also that are Iranian and Bactrian. So it's a very diverse community in many ways. the Judahite community takes a very pragmatic pragmatic position, I think, in acknowledging other gods. It's trying to rub alongside lots of different communities. And when you make an agreement with somebody, whether it's if it's a financial transaction, very often they swear by their gods and you swear by your gods, or maybe you swear by each other's gods. These are sort of pragmatic considerations of how communities get along. So in some ways, not surprising. I would say I don't know that this community. It has three divine figures that it honors and worships. They don't seem to have a problem, particularly in recognizing or utilizing the names of other gods when it comes to sort of rubbing along with their neighbors.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Brown. Your remarks.
Yeah, I won't add anything more about Amherst 63. I think that covers it well. But I think that phenomenon of the Jewish people in the Second Temple period, but also before that and also after that, were living alongside a range of people with a range of different viewpoints, and they didn't always take an exclusivistic "we're right, everybody else is wrong" kind of standpoint. And that's even true in the New Testament. So, the other comment that mentions 1 Corinthians 8.
Yeah.
It's an interesting text that starting in verse 4, you've got, hence, as to eating of food offered to idols, we know that, quote, no idol in the world really exists, end quote, and, quote, there is no God but one, end quote. But then Paul goes on to say, indeed, even though there are many so-called gods in heaven and on earth, in fact, there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom all things and through whom we exist. It is not everyone, however, who has this knowledge, since some have been accustomed to idols until now, they still think the food offered to them is offered to an idol, and their conscience being weakly defiled. And so he has this very pragmatic question, like, are you going to go astray if you eat food that's been sacrificed to an idol? And he's like, well, no, really. They're not real gods, so it's not actually doing anything. But people are accustomed to thinking of them as gods, and in fact, there are all sorts of gods and lords. But for us, there's only one. And so you have this acknowledgement of this kind of religious diversity, acknowledgement that his own audience maybe is in different standpoints on how they relate and think about those things, trying to hold together a cohesive community that worships one God in Jesus in the midst of this, what we might call pluralistic society. And in other texts, Paul is quite comfortable drawing connections. He could, go into Athens and point to the altar to an unknown God and say, hey, that's our God. He can quote, pre-Socratic philosophers, Parmenides saying, in whom we live and move and have our being, and apply that to the Christian God. And so this doesn't disappear, whether in the Jewish Bible or at Elephantine or in the early Christian period, like this nuanced way of trying to affirm, on the one hand, yes, there is actually one God, and we know that God, well, in a Jewish context, through the Torah, the Tanakh, or we know that God through Jesus in a Christian context, while also acknowledging that how people engage with that is complex and shouldn't just immediately, or doesn't always have to be immediately dismissed as inherently wrong, but maybe just incomplete, or maybe needs some clarification, or maybe is just not quite there, but might be moving in the right direction, or might be moving off in a very wrong direction and needs to be steered back. But like all of those kinds of nuances are available to them. They didn't have this, or at least they didn't always have this kind of binary view that somebody like Jan Hassman talks about the Mosaic, like truth and falsehood. Like, no, it wasn't always. There was a range of ways of thinking about not only deity in general, but how the God of Israel or the God of Jesus relates to what other people think of as gods.
Well, and also, you've got texts in the New Testament to talk about thrones and principalities and powers, and they're not talking about human things there. Again, they're talking about the divine world. But even in that text in 1 Corinthians, I mean, Paul is making some astonishing moves there, isn't he? Because he's usually thought to be quoting the Shema, Deuteronomy 6 verse 4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," and he's famously bifurcating it. So he's applying the term Elohim or Theos to the Father, and he's applying Kyrios to the Son. So he's making some astonishing exegetical moves that are not straightforwardly monotheistic in any way. I mean, is Paul being playful? I mean, he's just not fitting into our categories in any sense, I think.
And I see this recurrent thing that we do, as perhaps this is a human thing. I don't know. I'm not sure. But we almost all the time we're trying just to concentrate everything, just to really putting everything just in one term, reducing everything just to one single term. And it doesn't work like that most of the times. And in religion, that I've seen that pattern happen over and over again. Now, let's move the conversation, gentlemen. So question number 4 is right there on the screen. And this has to do, but ancient Israelite religion. I don't know if that's the correct, accurate term. You can correct me on that. But, perhaps the consensus, and this is by reading, Marcus Smith, and some others, big names there. Actually, Marcus Smith is called the Divine Council guy. I don't know why, but perhaps because he has written out extensively on this topic. But anyways, so, the consensus says that the ancient Israelite religion evolved from polytheism to, monotheism. So this conclusion is drawn in part from those passages alluding to a divine council. And a variety of terms have been proposed with respect to this. Monolatrous henotheism, megatheism, revolutionary monotheism, and so on. So, in your view, and I go with you, Dr. Brown, how can a monotheistic stance, if any, prevailed in light of this divine assembly in the Hebrew Bible?
I found this an interesting question because it starts all with definitions and then takes this shift to the divine council at the end.
Yeah.
So I'll leave the questions of definitions to Nathan, since that's his area of expertise. But in terms of the divine council, I mean, this is really common language across the ancient Near East, of course, whether it's the explicit phrase, the council of God, or the council of particular God, or the council of the gods, or it's described as the sons of God. And you do have this appear at various points in the Jewish Bible. Beginning of Job is one, obviously, in Psalm 82 that we've already talked about. And I mean, Nathan touched on this earlier. Like it reflects this really widespread ancient Near Eastern conception of gods as royalty. What does a king have? They have a court, and they have an army, and they have servants. And the existence of these beings are not seen to detract from their power or supremacy. They're emblematic of it. They reflect the fact that they're supreme and powerful. And the more servants they have, in some ways, the more powerful they are. And so there are plenty of biblical texts. I shouldn't say plenty. There are various biblical texts that reflect that same imagery and take it for granted. Psalm 82 begins there, the beginning of Job. The Satan, it's not a name, but the Satan, the accuser, comes before the Lord in the midst of the sons of God. There's just an assumption that this is the way that the divine realm is structured. And the issue at play in that text is not, does the divine council exist? That's just taken for granted. The issue is it possible to worship God for no reason? And, is God's rule of the world in fact just, or do people only worship God because they get good benefits out of it? And they're, God's this kind of cosmic mob boss that's going to hold it over your head and knock you off if you don't get in line. Those are the issues that are at play, and the divine council is just there. So in that context, the question of monotheism, the question of God's supremacy, again, if our definition is only one God exists, then you're going to have a problem there. But if your definition is that there is one God who's categorically supreme over all others, like none of these other figures are any sort of a threat to or on the same level of, or probably even pre-exist the one God who's in control, then the divine council is not a problem at all for that. And the fact that even late biblical authors are quite happy to use this imagery, it suggests that they don't see it as a threat to God's uniqueness, but a way of describing it.
Thank you. Before going with Professor MacDonald, Joshua says some conservative Christians normally says that the fathers never believe that the divine council is real, and that the only references are against the Gnostics. What is your opinion about it? Okay, let's wait on that, Joshua. But first, Professor MacDonald, your comments on the previous question here that I posed to you both.
I mean, I'd agree with all that Ken has said. I think it's very helpful. I mean, it's quite clear even in New Testament texts that there is the divine realm is populated. There are angelic figures. Many of these figures are named, whether they're Gabriel or Michael or whatever. It's clear that if you turn to a book like Revelation, that there are these angelic hosts. So heaven is not empty in this world. There are lines of continuity running through from aspects of that imagery change, and some of that reflects other shifts that are going on in terms of the kinds of intellectual influences that are coming on the Second Temple Judaism, particularly into the Hellenistic and the Roman periods. And the social world, the kinds of metaphors that are going to make most sense in a social world that is also changing. So again, religion is never standing still, but is always moving and shifting. And some of these things may be sitting somewhat in tension with one another. And I do think. I think a number of different things are going on in the Second Temple period. I mean, one of the things I've tried to write on was the way that, for example, in the book that you pointed out, the one on prophecy and on early apocalypticism, that there is more reflection. If we look at, say, Josephus or the New Testament, on the idea of oneness, there begins to develop a sort of theology of a sort of thinking upon what it might mean to say that God is one. And that this is built into a sort of theology that we see in, so you see, for example, in Paul, there's sort of one faith, one Lord, one baptism. We see similar expressions in Josephus. There's one temple, one city, one people. So there's a kind of generation of a kind of oneness theology. Other things that are going on in this period are, there is much more. Both outsiders and insiders seem to recognize that Judaism has some very distinctive features. These are not just theological ideas. This is sometimes understood by outsiders as sort of an expression of atheism. They don't do cultic worship in the way that cultic worship is seen elsewhere in the Greco-Roman world. But also, they have strange practices. They don't eat pork. They're circumcised. So there is much more of a sense of there is a kind of differentiation going on as well, and that some of that is the world of Yehudites encountering the Greco-Roman world, and a sort of differentiation that happens. So there's there are lots of different things that are going on at the same time, and some of these may not always be sort of working out consistently with one another. Interesting to raise the question of Gnosticism, and this in its own way is an attempt, I think, to bring together certain sort of certain aspects of Near Eastern thought as it's developed, Near Eastern mysticism, together with some elements that seem to owe something to Judaism or Christianity, and also Greco-Roman philosophy. So these are again, sort of go back to one of the things that Ken said earlier. This is not heading off in one direction, and it takes on lots of complex and different forms as these sort of swirling influences of philosophical, theological, social thinking are happening.
Thank you for that. Okay, let's move on here. So we're almost there. Not because I want to end. No, I want to just continue forever. But I want to respect doctors their time. We want to value that. So question number 5. Some seem to argue for a revolutionary Jewish monotheism during the late Second Temple period and immediately afterwards. How tenable can this claim be, or should we toss it out altogether? Dr. Brown, let's go with you first.
All right.
Oh my goodness.
I could go the same way I went before, just say no. But no, I mean, I think that this is also one of those places where
full stop
matter. Like when you're talking about revolution, like what do you mean by revolutionary? I think this language goes back, or at least it was popularized by Jan Assmann. There was a really great collected volume by Beda Pongratz-Leisten, 2009 or something like that, wrestling with this concept. But like, if your concept of revolutionary is, on the one hand, like there's this big movement and a wave of shift, I'm not so sure about that. And if your question of revolution is there's this dramatic, one moment when everything changed, then I'm also not so sure about that. But I do think it's fair to say that, what we're calling monotheism looks very different by the late Second Temple period than it did, say, in, the late pre-exilic period. And I don't think that happened at one moment. I don't think it followed one trajectory, but it happened. The way people are talking about the God of Israel in the late Second Temple period are certainly quite different. And the ways in which the kind of base level polemics about worshiping other gods, for instance, largely shift from, oh no, our own people are constantly worshiping the wrong gods and we've got to put them back on the right path, to, well, everybody just kind of assumes that the Jews worship one God, and the issue is how do they relate to everybody else's gods? Like the conversation has shifted, and again, not just in one way, but I don't think that happened at one moment, and I don't think that you can trace that to an exact historical event, or I don't even think you can trace it necessarily to a particular like social religious movement if you see that as some sort of like collective thing, unless you're talking about Judaism as a whole. It's certainly the case that things shift, and the assumptions about even what we think of as a god look very different by the end of this period than they do earlier on. And part of that's a reflection of, the changes in ancient Near Eastern history. Part of that's a reflection of, consolidation of the Jewish Bible itself. Part of that's a reflection of engagement with Greco-Roman philosophy and this kind of like philosophical conception of one God, which could quite happily sit alongside a belief in many beings called gods that are not the one God, but are still gods. But that conversation is now in a whole different social, political, religious context. And Gnosticism was part of that, but that, of course, is going to make the conversation look very different than in the earlier period. And I don't think you can trace that to one moment, but that doesn't mean it hasn't happened.
There you have it, people. Thank you. Professor MacDonald, what do you have to say about this question? I put it right here again.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I agree a lot with what Ken says. I mean, I do think that I think that's absolutely right. But by the time we get to the late Second Temple period, there is very much a sense, both for outsiders and for insiders, that Judaism is very different. it's aniconic, and this is unusual in a Greco-Roman context. It has certain social practices that do mean that certainly for certain Jews, maybe not necessarily all, but for certain Jews, this did create certain problems in terms of sort of social interactions, and it did seem very sort of exclusivist. I mean, Jonathan Adler has recently argued that really a very important moment is the Hasmonean revolt and the Maccabean revolt and the sort of the kind of the early kingdom of the Hasmoneans. I mean, not so much that some of these things can't trace roots to earlier, but that actually there becomes a much perhaps because of their rulership over Judea, that there's much more of a sort of homogenizing of Judaism at that point. It becomes clear what it means. It does mean definitely not eating pork. It does mean sort of keeping Torah. We begin to see ritual washing, ritual pools, in many more places. So some of these things have got earlier roots, but they don't seem to have been practiced universally in the way that they used to be. And that's not just it. That's partly an expression, probably, of sort of Hasmonean sort of hegemony and a sort of coercive practices within the Hasmonean kingdom. I mean, there are some very, very complex movements going on in the Hellenistic and Roman period, and it's not just simply one of pushing Hellenism away. It's also embracing it in very, very complex ways as well. Judaism in this period is both sort of thoroughly Hellenized and in its own and in other ways resisting Hellenism. So the dynamics are very complex, and these touch on a whole host of areas, not only practice but also, yes, thought.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm gonna ask you the things here, because we're just on the last thing to address here in this interview, for which we're very thankful to you both for your time. So just to round it up, the conversation, I know, and as I always say in this kind of interviews, I know, please understand, this type of interview it doesn't do justice to this topic. I mean, you just need to skim through those books. It's a lot of pages right there, a lot of bibliographies, and a lot of research. So what we're trying is just to, go scratching the surface, going over the basic points here on this type of topics. And that's what we're trying to do. So please just round that up, the conversation. I'll go with you first, Dr. Brown, about what we've been talking so far. And also, as you can see on the screen, just give us, recommended literature, books, monograph, dissertations, monograph, articles, everything. And I'm going to be dropping links on the comments here on this episode, so people can go there, click on it, and they can go there and get their own copy, or start reading by themselves. So let's go with that. Dr. Brown, let's give us just the final remarks on this topic.
Sure. Thanks, Marv. Marv.
You can say whatever. That's no problem. I like Marv, but I've been telling people that it has to be Mer because it's German. But no, I love Marv. Let's go that way.
I think for me, the biggest takeaway is just the openness, the importance of openness to wrestling with these texts without assuming that they all agree with each other. Being able to approach the diversity of images of God within whether the Jewish Bible or the Christian Bible, or more broadly when you're talking about Judaism and Christianity, with an openness to the fact that beliefs and practices not only vary, but that they reflect really deep wrestling with what it means to follow God and how to relate to one's neighbors, whether near and far, and that there's actually a lively debate going on here between a whole host of different perspectives about what does it actually mean to live faithfully and worship God well, and giving the text the space to do that in their own ways without trying to flatten them all into one perspective, I think is really important. And so any definitions that we use, any historical frameworks that we want to appeal to, any distinctions we want to draw should lead us to seeing more clearly the distinctiveness and the contours and the diversity of these texts rather than eliminating that. In terms of bibliography, I mean,
that's a difficult.
Where do you start?
I think the first one should be this book that I've been just showing up on the screen here for the people, the one you co-wrote with Professor MacDonald. I think it's a must for people to go and reading. But beside that, what else do you have in your mind to recommend?
I mean, I think there's still some. I would still recommend Mark Smith's it's almost become a classic work now, but Gods in Translation, The Origins of Biblical Monotheism. Really foundational, more recent, although not brand new, ways of just contextualizing what we call biblical monotheism within its broader Canaanite, but also broader ancient Near Eastern contexts. I mentioned that collected volume by Beda Pongratz-Leisten earlier, which I think is just a really great collection. There's an excellent long article by Peter Machinist in there on Psalm 82. But also Pongratz-Leisten's introduction is really helpful in framing things in terms of its broader ancient Eastern context. So that's probably where I would start. If you're talking about our writing, I'm not sure that book is actually what I would point to. Nathan's dissertation is, I think, still foundational. Whether we're talking about Deuteronomy particularly, or the distinction between monotheism and polytheism, and what do we mean by that? You mentioned earlier the piece I published on myth and monotheism in Job, and also trying to challenge those kind of binary categories. My whole dissertation is on the development of the book of Job and the way in which various figures are portrayed in complex and overlapping ways. So I would probably point to some of those other things we've written more than that particular volume. But I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Professor MacDonald.
I think I would go back to that initial place you started with what's the stake with this discussion, and I think it is also. I think it's exactly what Ken says. It's the openness to it's being open to change and dynamism within all these texts. Not to think that there's a single red thread running through, and to be endlessly surprised by them. And the way that ancient peoples, ancient Judahites, Israelites, Jews in the Second Temple period, but also others, just thought about religion in such sophisticated and interesting ways. I mean, one take home I think would be that actually very often it's not about belief. It's about practice. And one of the things we one of the dangers is sort of emphasizing the theological is to forget just how important ritual is, and practice in all of its richness. In terms of books, maybe I'll mention Saul Ollien's work. I think is helpful sometimes for the correctives it gives for to other work. A couple of Joachim Sharper has a big book on monotheism as well. I might mention a couple of things for readers to look out for that I know are coming out soon. There was a conference in Brown University by Saul Ollien and some of his students, edited volume. I think that's probably going to appear in the next year or so. So do look out for that. And there's also a collection of essays by Howell Clifford and Joachim Sharper that's due to come out in the Flant series. So that's again in the next year or so. I've got an essay in there on monotheism in the priestly literature. So I think particularly if people listening want to get a sense of sort of where scholarship currently is at, and then
Yeah,
also
yeah.
through the bibliography to go back to sort of
Yeah,
recent scholarship.
that's
Those two forthcoming works will be a great place to go.
Thank you. Thank you so much to you both for that. Okay, I got the things here. The first one, Marduk Spear asks, does anyone know where Ellen White is now? I think, Marduk, you are referring... Okay, I'm talking to Marduk. How about that? So I think you're referring to Ellen White's famous The Structure of the Divine Council, if I'm not mistaken, which is published by Moore Civic. If that's the person you're asking about, I have no idea. What about you, gentlemen? Do you have an idea where Ellen White is now?
Well, she's married to a German pastor, so yeah, she lives in Germany. I can't remember exactly where the parish is.
Oh,
but yeah,
there you have it. There you have it. Breaking news. Okay, finally, my co-host here. Question: according to Qumran in Second Temple period, what about the concept of the gods' angels as bearers of God's attributes, like Michael or Yahweh? Anyone?
Bring up another big ball of wax right at the end. Let's just talk about the 2 towers controversy.
Okay, this is a very highlight of this interview. Oh my goodness! Now you make my day, Dr. Brown. Okay, yeah.
I mean, I'll just say one sentence that I mean, I think this is another example of trying to make sense of God within a particular cultural context and using the categories that are available, whether it's like Platonistic categories or if your conception of God is no longer like those 4 tiers that we talked about in the ancient Near East, but is, God and then everything else, then you still have all these other figures. And so you got to call them angels, but some of them clearly are described as almost like standing in place of God. You got the angel of the Lord at various places. And so what do you do with those figures? And so this is one way that they tried to make sense of that and tried to, toe the line between there's only one God, nothing else. But also there's these others that, what do we do with them? And so this is one solution, I think.
Joshua says, sorry, I never asked simple questions. Okay.
Well, these are, the other side is a sort of spiritual side as well, that these are all these are all attempts to reflect. Step after God. What's the, for many, particularly in this later period, arguably also in the earlier period, but in the later period, to think about, to sort of try and grasp something of the essence of God, is very much a sort of, is a very important religious practice. That I don't think, there are lots of ways in which people have done this over time, and we could think about proofs for the existence of God as another way in which people have done this. These are not, we sometimes misunderstand them if we think that they are simply trying to sort of do theology, wrap it all up nicely and tie it with a bow. It is rather much more a way of reflecting and thinking. It's again, we might think of it much more of as a spiritual practice. Marv,
oh, you lost me. Oh, there you go. Oh, there you go. Thank you. Sorry about that. The gods are the gods. Yeah, I'm gonna put the blame. Yeah, I'm putting the blame on the gods. They are conspiring against me on this channel. No, don't do it. Don't shut my podcast down because I need it. Thank you, Professor MacDonald. Okay, well, I think that's it, people. I just want to say thank you for your comments, for being here and joining us in this conversation. I love this topic. I'm pretty sure we haven't even scratched the surface. I want to thank Professor MacDonald, Dr. Kim Brown for being here. I want to say this is, in the case of Professor MacDonald, it's not the first time. He was one of the first scholars who kindly accepted my invitation to come here, along many others. So I just want to say publicly thank you for that. And Dr. Brown, thank you also for joining us. I want to say this is a platform for you scholars to discuss this type of topic, to have this kind of conversation, because we want to bring some sanity into this whole mess in this social media, and also we want to help to correct a lot of misinformation that is on the social media as well. And we can only do that through scholars, and we bridging the gap and bringing this kind of interviews to you people there who's watching this kind of interviews. So with Professor MacDonald and Dr. Ken Brown, we say, everybody, thank you for being here. It will be until the next episode. Please check out our following interviews and just be ready because we want to bring more right there here. So with them, until the next time, take care. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye.